My featured game from round 8 of Shamkir is Vishwanathan Anand with the white pieces against Shamkir Mamedyarov. We join the game after 16 moves. It's a typical king's pawn opening. This position actually arose from 4 knights opening, but it could well have come from the Spanish, for example. White has a slight space advantage. You can see that black has pawns there. So, white has a little bit more room for his pieces. But the dilemma is what you do with that centre. Both sides have developed very well. If white exchanges on e5, then he has absolutely nothing in his position. There's no structural advantage whatsoever. And for the moment, it's not possible to push forward either. So what do you do? Well, Anand managed to push forward here, so he's increasing his space advantage. But Mamedyarov picked off a square on this side of the board. a4 is a nice move because it cramps these 2 pawns. Whoops, those 2 pawns, and gives black a little bit more space at the side of the board. Anand plays patiently. It could well be that he's building up to push with d5 at some moment. But for the moment he's just waiting. And that pays off because Mamedyarov now exchanges on d4. So it's quite clear that having given up this strong point on e5, white has a big space advantage. But still doesn't mean he has any kind of tangible advantage. Here, for example, well, I quite like the idea for black of just exchanging on d4 and playing queen a5. I think the queen has a lot of influence over the centre and could well find its way to one of these squares. And you can see that knight on g6 does a good job. It's looking at this square on f4. I feel that Mamedyarov should have decent counterplay in that position. Instead he played knight e5. It's also not a bad move. White has to be very careful about exchanging off on e5. For example, something like this would leave this pawn weak, and maybe d4 weak as well. And you have to watch out a bishop coming in here. So Anand just nudged back with the bishop, protecting the knight on f3. This is good. Bishop c5. Now, it looks as though this might be a strong move for white, just damaging black's pawn structure and giving white a nice 4-3 pawn majority on the king side. But you can see black's queen is beautifully placed there, controlling these squares on e5 and f4, and it's very hard for white to work this kingside pawn majority, actually. And in the meantime, this square, you never know, black may be able to land something on the d4 square. So certainly inadvisable to exchange, and Vishy just played rook d2, preparing to double rook. So this is very sound, and by now I think Vishy's starting to gain a real grip on the centre. Mamedyarov has an interesting idea in mind. His play looks a bit passive to me, but actually has an interesting idea. Now Vishy starts to turn to the king side, having established a strong grip in the centre. This knight would love to come into this wonderful post on f5, just sort of lurking around black's king side, and particularly as black's pieces are the other side of the board, this queen is on the wrong side, then a knight on f5 and a potential kingside attack looks very interesting, followed perhaps by f4. But here is Mamedyarov's idea. He exchanged and played c5, giving up the pawn on d6, but in playing c5 he spins the knight round and he's looking to get in on that weak square on d4 and perhaps leave this rook stranded here. But Vishy dealt with this very well. First the knight comes in and that protects the rook. The knight comes into d4, so that's the big idea, so that if knight takes, then queen takes rook. But for the moment, that rook is safe. If black exchanges on f5, then you can see that, well, that's more than safe. that's going to be winning for white. So knight e5 from Mamedyarov. So this, again, I'm sure he anticipated this. This is his idea. He's hoping that Vishy will simply exchange rooks when white is a pawn up, but black has good control over the dark squares, that wonderful knight on d4 that can be protected by knight number 2 coming into c6. It's an interesting idea, but very quickly Vishy declined to play rook takes rook and instead played rook d5. Excellent move, giving up the exchange. This was taken. So Vishy has one pawn for the exchange, but you can see he's about to get rid of that knight on d4, and he has a wonderful pawn centre, not to mention chances for an attack on the king side. Now here's an interesting moment. Vishy chose to play f4, going for a kingside attack. He could have played in a much safer way, just taking a second pawn, and this ending is pretty pleasant for white. Once that rook comes maybe to b4, perhaps you can push through the middle. White stands better here, but I think it's an interesting choice from Vishy, that instead he prefers to play for the attack, pushing forward on the king side, and that bishop reaching this fantastic diagonal, looking down towards black's king. Again, Vishy declines to exchange queens, turning towards the king side because, you know, there aren't that many pieces around black's king. b5. Vishy finally exchanges off that knight on d4 and wants to go in there, so that's why that knight had to be taken, and the bishop maintains its position on this menacing diagonal, b4. And here, well, Mamedyarov was in time pressure, and Vishy was moving quite quickly, actually. He could have gone for a direct attack with f5 and f6 and knight h5. That's a possibility, or indeed knight h5 immediately. Instead, Vishy played knight f5. I think, well, anyway, it's another way of playing it. Knight f5 is a very sound move as well. But Mamedyarov finds a little bit of counterplay. But now white's pawn's rolling through the middle. I mean, with Mamedyarov in time pressure, I think this is almost an impossible position to defend, actually. And Vishy keeps things very steady. Obviously that rook would like to come down here, but rook d2 stops that. Mamedyarov grabs a pawn. Maybe d3 would have been a better chance, but as I said, in time pressure, this is almost impossible to defend. The a pawn means absolutely nothing. That's securely blockaded by the bishop. And now, finally, when everything is ready, Vishy rolls through the middle of the board and turns back to the king side as well, actually. And they'd reached the time control, but by this stage, the game is over. In fact, Mamedyarov resigned in this position. Well, the rook can blockade, but then queen d4 followed by e6 sets up decisive threats on the king side. There's nothing that black can do. I remember Gelfand saying round about the time of their World Championship match in 2012 that if you allow Vishy the right kind of position where he has this sort of rolling initiative and in a very classical way, then he is unstoppable. And I think Vishy got exactly the right position in this game. It was a really impressive performance. It seems to me over the past year, Vishy has got back this practical feel for chess. You know, his understanding has always been there, but it's that match fitness that has really returned to his play that, well, you know, it's really showing. He's on tremendous form, and on the live rating list, Vishy is actually back to number 2 in the world. It's an incredible achievement. Well, that victory leaves Anand with 5.5 out of 8, only half a point behind Magnus Carlsen, who drew with Wesley So. Well, a very comfortable game for Carlsen. So Carlsen, going to the last round, Magnus Carlsen has 6, Anand has 5.5. In the last round, Magnus Carlsen has white against Mamedyarov, the weakest player in the tournament. Anand has black against Caruana. So although anything can happen in the last round, Carlsen still looks to be the clear favourite to win the tournament. Have I got time? Yeah, I've got a little bit of time. Let me just show you one more game from yesterday. There were some exciting games. Michael Adams won his first game against Anish Giri, and well, there was something very single-minded again about Adams' play. It was a Sicilian, and he'd been patiently preparing his breakthrough on the king side. You can see white's pieces massing on the right-hand side of the board. Let's see how Mickey broke through. F6, that has to be taken. So having given up this pawn, black's king is open, and now the knight throws itself towards black's king side, and it's impossible to defend this. I mean, there are many ways to go. Rook takes d6 is really convincing. If that's taken, then bishop h6, well, you can see that there are so many things threatened here, and white is also going to turn his attention towards black's king as well. It's over. Giri tried bishop g7, but this was in vain. Simply bishop h6. And after rook c6, queen g4 check is disastrous. The king went in the corner, and now a very simple winning move. Rook takes knight, and here Giri resigned, because if king takes rook, knight f6 check. If the king goes backwards, and that's mate. And if rook takes knight, then that leaves the queen undefended. And that's very simple. Wonderful victory from Michael Adams. He is also a very fine player, but not having the best tournament, but I'm delighted that he won his first game. In the other decisive game of the round, Kramnik defeated Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, so he bounces back a little bit. So it's going to be a very exciting last round, and do join me for a report on it on this channel.